Senator Fawcett.
Mr Acting Deputy President, welcome back. Good to have you join us. I'd like to canvass three things in my brief contribution to this discussion, and it is an important discussion about infrastructure in our nation. I'd like to revisit the quote that Mark Twain attributed to Benjamin Disraeli about lies, damn lies and statistics, just to correct the record on a few things that the honourable senator opposite said in her contribution. I'd like to talk about some of the facts of funding and particularly touch on a few projects in South Australia, my home state. She's correct, Mr Albanese did come out and draw on using the June 2013 quarter figures and compare to show a 20.1% decrease. But that was very selective, because if you actually look at the overall funding, and particularly if you compare the last quarter, so the September quarter, the last quarter of the Labor government, and the latest quarter results for this government, there's actually a 4.7% increase in transport infrastructure work done for the public sector, a 14.5% increase in roads, highways and bridges done for the public sector. So almost anyone with enough diligence can cherry-pick two specific periods, compare them and say, Chicken Little, the sky's falling in, funding has decreased, but you need to look at the overall allocation of funding and particularly look at the trends of those last quarters rather than specific quarters plucked to highlight that difference. Prime Minister Disraeli was correct indeed when he said there are lies, damn lies and statistics, and they can be manipulated, and I think it's to the shame of members on that side of the chamber that they would resort to misleading the Australian public by that approach. The coalition government has in fact, and this is according to the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics, if you look at what it has done, it has had an 18.6% increase to $27.4 billion in engineering construction work compared to the previous quarter, and a 6.9% increase to $6.1 billion in transport infrastructure work done, and a 12.4% increase to $6.6 billion for engineering construction work done for the public sector. And so across a range of sectors over time we see that there's actually an increase. And that's why the coalition government can rightly say we're investing a record $50 billion to get vital infrastructure projects underway across the country. And you can look all around this country, in different states, and particularly where there are projects of national significance, you see the federal government not only contributing money, but looking to encourage the states to find innovative ways to raise the capital to invest in their own productive capacity so that the states and the states' economies can grow. In my own state of South Australia, some $2.9 billion, $2.9 billion allocated by this government to infrastructure projects. The North-South Corridor is one that's been well known, and just recently the Northern Connector announced in South Australia. As well as those major projects, it's important to realise that there's additional funding on top of the normal allocation, some $200 million for the Black Spot program. Now, in South Australia, that's a particularly important program because the state government is not providing the funding that's required for our country roads. Accidents on country roads account for 70% of the fatalities in South Australia. If you look at fatalities per 100,000, the East Coast states, it's 4.2 in Victoria, 4.5 in New South Wales, 4.8 in Queensland, 6.4 in South Australia. And so if South Australia even just funded its roads to bring us back to the national average, that's 30 lives and 250-odd serious injuries every year that we would save. So that federal government money to try and top up and encourage the rectification of some of those black spots is really important. There's some $350 million for the Roads to Recovery program and $230 million for the National Highway program for safety and productivity improvements. In addition to that, in June this year, the Australian government announced that councils across Australia will receive an extra $1.1 billion over the next 2 years under the Road to Recovery program, and that follows the reintroduction of the Consumer Price Index linkage for fuel, the fuel excise. And it's important there to realise that there is a funding source that the government has created specifically to address infrastructure, as opposed to just increasing the borrowings, which ultimately the taxpayer has to pay for, plus the interest. And so this is a government that's serious about making contributions to infrastructure, but we're also serious about getting the funding right. We should never forget that much of what Labor promised when it was in government and what it called funding commitments actually lay outside the Ford estimates. And if it's outside the Ford estimates, then it's not real money. It's not actually included in any of the calculations for the budget in terms of whether we're actually going to be in surplus or not, or whether we're contributing to a future deficit. Much of their promise relied on a mining tax that didn't raise revenue, in fact cost the nation money. And so when you see promises from the other side, the public must also look at the fact, are they actually funded? Because we've seen a lot of promises and a lot of disappointment compared to this side, who have actually funded projects and started projects and has put in place appropriate mechanisms to make sure that that funding is available. There are things like the $5 billion financing facility for infrastructure projects in Northern Australia, concessional loan arrangements for WestConnex, grants for projects that won't have a direct financial return for an investor, plans for trialling new road pricing arrangements on things like the Northern Connector in South Australia or the Perth Freight Link. And importantly, and this is something we've been encouraging state governments to get on board with, the Asset Recycling Initiative that provides grants to states and territories that make further investment in infrastructure whose funding it receives from asset sales. So this is a government that's serious about finding the funding so that we can not just promise, but we can actually start delivering. There's also been a lot of comment by members opposite to say that this government is opposed to rail projects, which is clearly not correct. Just recently we saw the announcement of the commitment to capped funding of $95 million to Stage 2 of the Gold Coast Light Rail. And the reason for that is because of its significance to the success of the 2008 Commonwealth Games. And so as I look to rail projects in my home state of South Australia, and the electrification of the Adelaide to Gawler railway line has been raised a number of times, and the inference being that that project has stopped because of this government. Well, history is really important. If we don't actually understand history and the sequence of timeframes and decisions, then we'll be misled. And so I'd like to just remind members of this Senate and the public who may be listening to this debate about some of the timeframes. So the Gawler modernisation project was announced in 2009 with a federal Labor government commitment of $293 million, which included the full electrification of the line and re-sleepering. The overall project started to blow out, and the South Australian government threw an extra $100.2 million into it in their 2011-12 budget. But by 2012, in June of 2012, works were ceased by the South Australian government. Now, who was in government at the time? Not the coalition. Works were ceased due to a lack of funding by the South Australian government in June of 2012. So since this government has come to power, we have made massive investments in infrastructure projects, $2.9 billion in South Australia. We have invested in rail, such as that case in the Gold Coast. And if the South Australian government wants to make a case and come back to the federal government and show why that project is a priority for them and why it's of national significance and we should be supporting it, I will be very happy to work with them. But senators opposite shouldn't be trying to mislead the Australian public into thinking that that project has stopped because of this government, because it stopped in June of 2012. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, former Prime Minister Abbott declared that he did indeed want to be the infrastructure Prime Minister, and history shows, when you look at the facts, that record investment has been made, and not just record investment, but sound management to make sure that the funding is available so that these projects are not just promised in the out years where there's no real commitment, but it is actually funded, work is starting, and we've seen that in our home state of South Australia, where the North-South Corridor and Northern Connector are either working, soon to commence, or next year the Northern Connector will start. This bill touches on an important topic, but I think it's important that people listening to it understand the facts. And the facts are this government has made record contributions, and the amount of contributions in infrastructure are increasing.